He walked into the toy store with just enough money to buy one small gift, the last of his savings. What he didn't know was that the woman behind the counter owned everything in sight. And she wasn't just watching a customer, she was watching a man who reminded her what love really looked like. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain had started before sunrise, tapping on the windows of the small second-floor apartment like a soft warning. Mason stood at the kitchen sink, staring into the bottom of a cracked mug as if it might offer answers. It was his daughter's birthday. He had $5.62 left to his name. The fridge hummed behind him, half empty, and blinking its light over 2 eggs, a half carton of milk, and a birthday card Lila had made for him last year. Cut from printer paper and scribbled with crayons. She didn't know yet. She didn't know that he'd sold his watch last week. She didn't know that the last envelope from the power company had red on it. She didn't know that the only gift she might get this year was whatever he could find on clearance, if he could find anything at all. Lila's voice rang from the hallway, bright and innocent. "Daddy, are we still going to the store today?" He turned, forcing a smile, as he wiped his hands on a dish towel. "Of course, sweetheart. Got something special in mind for my birthday girl." She ran into his arms with all the force of her 7-year-old joy, and for a moment Mason could pretend the world wasn't falling apart. They bundled up, the rain soaking through his worn-out jacket before they even reached the car. The passenger door groaned when he opened it for her. The sedan coughed before it started. Every sound, every warning light on the dash reminded him that time was running out, and money had already run dry. They drove in silence for a while, passing brightly lit storefronts that advertised things he couldn't afford. Shiny bicycles, brand-new phones, flashy displays of glittering toys. He watched Lila's eyes light up at each one, and it broke him in ways he couldn't show. As they turned onto the quieter side of town, Mason spotted something, an old toy store with a faded sign and warm yellow light spilling through the windows. He'd never noticed it before. It looked untouched, like it didn't belong in this century, but something about it pulled him in. He parked. His hands were shaking. "This is the one," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as they stepped inside, the warmth of the little shop wrapping around them like a blanket. Mason exhaled slowly. For the first time all morning, the world stopped buzzing in his ears. The scent of old wood, lemon polish, and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. The shelves were lined with toys that didn't scream brand names, just handcrafted animals, puzzles, painted wooden trains. It felt like a place built on memories, not marketing. Lila's eyes widened. She moved carefully through the aisles, as if the toys might vanish if she touched them too quickly. Mason followed behind, his fingers grazing a shelf of small figurines, his mind calculating. He could spend no more than $5, not $6, not $5.50. $5 was gas money for tomorrow. It was eggs and a loaf of bread. But today it was her birthday. Behind the counter stood a woman, maybe in her early 30s, with soft brown hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. She wore no name tag, no corporate smile, just a quiet curiosity as she watched them from a distance. Her clothes were simple but elegant. She looked like someone who had no reason to be working in a place like this. Lila let out a gasp. On the highest shelf in the corner sat a teddy bear, soft cream fur, a navy blue ribbon around its neck, eyes stitched with thread, not plastic. "Daddy," she whispered. "That one. That's the one." Mason's heart sank as he stepped closer and saw the tag. $12.95. He crouched beside Lila and smiled gently, his voice tight. "Let's keep looking, honey. Maybe there's something just as special on the lower shelf." "But I love that one," she said, holding onto his arm. "It's smiling like Mommy used to." The words landed like a punch to the ribs. Mason closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself. The bear did have a kind smile, the kind he hadn't seen in months, the kind his daughter remembered far too well for her age. Behind them, the woman behind the counter quietly took a step forward, eyes fixed on Mason, watching the way his shoulders fell, the way he tried to hide the ache in his chest. She said nothing, but something in her expression changed. Mason held the teddy bear in his hands, the tag dangling like a taunt. $12.95. He looked down at Lila's face, flushed with excitement, and then back at the small bundle of fur. It wasn't just a toy, not to her, maybe not to him either, but the numbers didn't lie. He only had enough for a toy under $5 and maybe a snack on the way home if the car didn't cough out on the highway. He turned the bear over one last time and placed it gently back on the shelf. "Let's keep looking," he said softly, but his voice was cracked at the edges. Lila's face fell. She didn't cry, she didn't complain, but her eyes, those wide, knowing eyes, dimmed just enough to send another fracture through his already fragile chest. Claire watched from behind the counter, her hands resting on the glass display case like she might steady the moment with her own weight. She had seen this scene before in her store, the quiet sacrifices, the defeated shoulders. But something about this man was different, the way he knelt to his daughter's level, the way he tried to smile through the storm. He didn't wear his pride like armor, he wore it like a threadbare coat, one gust away from tearing. "Excuse me," she said gently, stepping around the counter. Her voice was calm, careful, like she was approaching a wounded animal. Mason turned, surprised. "That bear," she said, motioning toward the shelf. "I just realized it's part of an older collection. It was mislabeled." She reached up and carefully removed the price tag. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her voice faltered ever so slightly. "It's actually $4.99. Mason blinked. "Sorry?" She gave a small shrug. "Happens more than you'd think." He stared at her, unsure if he should believe it, unsure if it was pity or policy. But Lila was already beaming, holding the bear to her chest like it was made of gold. He didn't want to ruin that. "I'll take it," he said, reaching into his wallet and counting out the bills, one crumpled note at a time. Claire nodded, watching him more than the money. He didn't know it, but the moment he handed over that last dollar, he gave away more than his cash. He gave away a piece of his story, and she had every intention of finding out the rest. The receipt printed slowly, the hum of the machine almost louder than it should have been in the silence that followed. Mason folded the slip and tucked it into his wallet, though there was nothing left in there now, not a dollar, not a coin, just the faint smell of leather and the worn edges of a once proud man's hopes. Lila hugged the teddy bear tight, her cheeks pressed into its fur, her little fingers curling into the blue ribbon like she was holding on to something sacred. Mason kept his eyes on her, partly to avoid looking at the woman behind the counter, partly because it hurt less that way. "Thank you," he said, finally turning to Claire. His voice was rough, quieter than before. He wasn't sure what he was thanking her for. The bear, the discount, the grace of pretending it wasn't charity. Claire smiled, small, almost shy. "I'm glad she found something she loves." There was something in her tone, though, something unspoken, not pity, not exactly. Mason had felt pity before. He'd been handed it in lobbies, in waiting rooms, in glances that lasted too long when people saw his ring finger still wearing the imprint of a wedding band that had been gone for 3 years. This was different. She looked at him like she saw him. Not what he lacked. Lila tugged at his sleeve. "Can we go show Mr. Harvey? He always asks what I get for my birthday." Mason smiled down at her. "Of course, let's go." He opened the door, the chime above ringing again as the cold air rushed back in. Claire watched them leave, her hands tightening against the counter. She watched the way Mason adjusted his coat to wrap it around Lila, the way he leaned down to cover her head from the rain with his arm. A simple gesture, but it said everything. She should have looked away. She usually did, but she didn't. She watched until they were gone, until the reflection in the window was just her own face staring back at her. and for reasons she couldn't explain, something inside her stirred, something quiet and aching. She reached for the price tag she'd removed from the bear and held it in her palm. $12.95. She folded it slowly, tucked it into her pocket, and whispered under her breath, "That wasn't a mistake." The rain came down harder as they reached the car, thick sheets that blurred the world beyond the windshield. Mason buckled Lila in, his fingers trembling as he adjusted her seatbelt. She didn't notice. She was too busy introducing her new bear to the world, whispering stories into its stitched ears like it had always belonged in her life. He closed her door and slid into the driver's seat, exhaling as the chill clung to his clothes. The engine hesitated before starting, coughing like a smoker with a grudge. Mason gripped the wheel tighter, jaw clenched, praying to whoever was listening that the car would hold out just one more day. Lila giggled from the back seat. "Daddy, she said his name is Charlie. He wants to come with us to the shop tomorrow." Mason forced a smile. Then Charlie better get his paws ready for grease. She laughed, and for a moment everything else slipped away. But as they pulled out of the lot, Mason glanced back at the little toy shop in the mirror. The windows glowed warm against the gray, and though he couldn't see her, he knew the woman was still standing behind the counter. He could feel it, like the kind of silence that follows someone important leaving a room. Back home, their apartment felt colder than usual. The space heater in the corner groaned weakly, flickering before sputtering into stillness. Mason stood there for a beat, staring at it like maybe staring could will it back to life. It didn't. He peeled off his wet jacket and draped it over a chair, watching the water pool beneath it. Lila danced down the hallway with her bear, humming some made-up birthday song, and all he could think about was how thin the walls felt tonight, how close they were to breaking. He walked into the bathroom and closed the door softly behind him, leaned against the sink, ran the water, not because he needed it, but because the sound kept his thoughts from echoing too loudly. He looked at himself in the mirror, a man with nothing left in his wallet, no backup plan, no next move. But his daughter was smiling, and that bear was in her arms, and somehow that had to be enough, for now. The morning came with silence. No alarm, no clatter of dishes, just a soft gray light pressing against the blinds like the sky hadn't quite made up its mind. Mason was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed in a shirt he hadn't taken off. His hands were wrapped around a mug of lukewarm water. The coffee had run out 2 days ago, but the ritual felt necessary. Like pretending he had a normal morning routine might hold the rest of the day together. From the next room, the quiet rustle of blankets and a soft yawn echoed. Lila was waking up. He straightened his back, ran a hand through his hair, and wiped the fatigue from his face before it reached his eyes. When she came out, she was still clutching the bear, hair tangled from sleep, cheeks puffy but glowing. "Charlie says good morning," she said, lifting the bear's paw with childlike ceremony. Mason smiled. "Tell him I said thanks for watching over you." She beamed, plopping down on the couch, legs swinging. "Are we going to the shop today?" Mason hesitated. He should have answered quickly, but truth was, the shop hadn't seen a paying customer in over a week. The radiator job he'd finished on Monday was still unpaid, and the voicemail from the landlord last night was clear enough. If rent didn't land on his desk by Friday, the locks would change. He nodded anyway. "Yeah, we'll stop by after breakfast." He made them toast, dry, no butter. They were out. Lila didn't complain. She never did. She ate quietly, chatting to Charlie like the bear was an honored guest. When they reached the garage, the place felt heavier than usual. The rusted sign out front hung crooked, swaying in the wind. Inside it smelled like oil and cold metal. The heater was broken again. Tools were scattered where he'd left them, organized in chaos that only made sense to him. Mason sat behind the counter, flipping through a tattered ledger. Bills, names, empty boxes under paid. He closed the book, Then he looked up just in time to see a sleek black car slowing down in front of the garage. It parked, and from it stepped a familiar face, clean, elegant, slightly out of place in this forgotten part of town. The woman from the toy store. She stepped out of the car like she didn't belong there, and knew it. Claire wore a soft gray coat that looked far too new for the rust-stained sidewalk it brushed against. Her heels clicked lightly as she crossed the gravel lot, pausing just once to look up at the faded sign above the garage. For a second, she seemed unsure, like maybe she'd turn around. But she didn't. She walked straight in. The bell above the door rang shrill in the cold, hollow space. Mason looked up from behind the counter, his hand still resting on the closed ledger. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but confusion. For a moment, neither of them said a word. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," Claire said, her voice soft, carrying that same quiet calm she had when she changed the price on the bear. Mason stood slowly. Hard to forget someone who saves your daughter's birthday. She smiled, genuine this time, not the polite kind. "I wasn't sure if I should stop by, but I was in the area and thought maybe my car's been acting strange." He glanced past her at the luxury sedan parked outside. He could tell by the engine purr alone that it wasn't acting strange, but he didn't call her out on it. "Bring it around back," he said, wiping his hands on an old rag. "I'll take a look." She nodded and turned, the bell chiming again as she disappeared. Lila peeked out from the office doorway. "Daddy, that's the toy lady." Mason gave a small smile. "Yeah, it is." Claire pulled the car into the bay a few minutes later. Mason lifted the hood with practiced ease, staring at the pristine engine while pretending to find something wrong. He could smell the lie before he touched a tool. This wasn't about the car. She didn't need a mechanic. Still, he worked in silence, running his fingers over cables and hoses, buying time. Claire stood a few feet away, watching. Not the engine. Him. She wasn't here for a tune-up. She was here for answers, maybe the kind he wasn't ready to give. Mason leaned over the engine, letting the silence settle between them like dust on metal. He adjusted a clamp that didn't need adjusting, just to keep his hands moving. Claire didn't say anything at first. She stood with her arms crossed loosely over her coat, but it wasn't a defensive posture. It was something softer, more uncertain. "Your daughter," she finally said, her voice threading through the stillness. "She named the bear Charlie?" He nodded without looking up. Said he smiled like her mom used to. Claire went quiet again. He could feel her watching him, not just glancing, watching. Like she was trying to see past the grease-stained shirt and tired eyes, like she was collecting pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand yet. "You didn't have to change the price," Mason said after a moment, closing the hood with a hollow thud. "I would have figured something out." "I know," she replied. "That's why I did." Her honesty caught him off guard. He stared at her for a second, wiping his hands on the rag with slow, deliberate motions. She wasn't trying to flatter him. She wasn't trying to impress. She was just there. "You're not really just working the counter at a toy store, are you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, watching her reaction. Claire hesitated, the corner of her mouth tugging in something between a smirk and a sigh. "No," she said, "not really." He nodded once, like that was all he needed to hear. She stepped closer, boots crunching lightly on the concrete. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why didn't you take the bear? When you saw the price, I mean. Why not just charge it? Or promise to come back and pay?" Mason looked down, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I don't make promises I can't keep, and I've got enough debts already." Claire studied him for a moment longer. "That's rare." He shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just tired of owing people." She looked away, as if those words struck closer to home than she'd expected. Mason didn't press her. They stood there, two strangers in the middle of a garage that smelled like oil and quiet truths, both pretending this was about a car that didn't need fixing. Lila came bursting through the side door with Charlie the bear tucked under one arm, her rain boots clunking across the concrete. Daddy, Charlie wants to show Miss Toy Lady his dance." She twirled once, then held the bear up like he was floating. Claire laughed, the sound soft and real, and knelt down to Lila's level. "Well, I think Charlie might be the best dancer I've ever seen." Lila beamed, then looked between them. "Are you going to stay for lunch? Daddy makes grilled cheese that's kind of burnt on the edges, but I like it." Mason ran a hand down his face, half embarrassed, half grateful. "Lila." But Claire was already smiling. "Burnt grilled cheese? That's my favorite kind." Mason raised an eyebrow. "You're a terrible liar." "I am," she said, standing again. "But I meant it, if the offer's real." He hesitated. The apartment wasn't ready for guests. The fridge was nearly empty. He didn't even have paper towels. But the look on Lila's face, the way her fingers tightened around the bear in hope, left him with no choice. He gave a slow nod. "All right. But I warned you. No refunds." Back at the apartment, Claire stepped inside and paused. She didn't comment on the cracked tile in the entryway or the faint hum of the broken heater. Instead, she looked at the drawings taped to the fridge, the photo of Lila in a princess costume, the pair of muddy boots by the door, and smiled like it was the most precious place she'd ever been. Mason worked quickly in the kitchen, trying to make something out of almost nothing. Bread, a slice of cheese, a can of soup he found in the back of the cupboard. Claire sat with Lila at the table, listening as she explained Charlie's bedtime routine in elaborate detail. Mason glanced over every so often, expecting Claire to fake interest. But she didn't. She leaned in, nodded, asked questions like it all mattered. And maybe to her it did. When he finally served the sandwiches, burnt edges and all, she took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "Perfect." For the first time in a long while, Mason felt like maybe things weren't falling apart. Maybe somehow something was beginning. After lunch, the rain softened into a whisper against the windows, the kind of drizzle that makes the world feel paused. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up with Charlie nestled beneath her chin, her breath slow and steady. Mason stood by the kitchen sink, drying the last plate with a towel worn thin at the edges. Claire lingered near the table, her fingers tracing circles on the rim of her empty mug. Neither of them spoke for a while. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. But eventually, Claire broke it. "She's something else," she said quietly, her eyes on Lila. Mason glanced over his shoulder. "She saved me, not the other way around." Claire looked at him, really looked. "It's obvious how much you love her. She's all I have." There was no hesitation in his voice, no drama, just truth. And it hit her harder than she expected, because she realized in that moment that there were entire buildings filled with people who called her Ma'am and Miss Ashford, people who took orders and cashed checks, and not a single one of them would ever say something like that about her. "You do it all on your own?" she asked. Mason nodded, folding the towel and placing it on the counter. "Yeah, since Lila was 4. Her mom passed suddenly, no warning, just one day here, next day, gone. I'm sorry." He nodded again, eyes downcast. "Me too." Claire stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever let anyone help you?" He let out a quiet breath, somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh. "Help's usually got strings. Or pity. I don't have the energy for either." "I'm not offering either," she said. He met her eyes, searching for the catch, the hidden motive. But there wasn't one. "I'm not looking for someone to fix everything," he said slowly. "Just someone who doesn't run when things aren't perfect." Claire tilted her head. "I'm not running." "No," he said, almost surprised by his own voice. "You're not." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence between them felt less like emptiness and more like understanding. The next morning brought sunlight, sharp and golden, pouring through the window like it was trying to shake the whole world awake. Mason rubbed his eyes, blinking against the light. It had been a long time since he'd slept in, Somehow the apartment felt warmer than usual, quieter, lighter, like something heavy had been set down. Claire had already gone. He found a note on the table, scribbled in neat, graceful handwriting. "Thank you. For lunch, for the stories, for letting me stay. I'll see you again soon, Claire." No phone number, no address, just a promise written in ink. He folded the note carefully and slid it into the back pocket of his wallet, next to receipts he hadn't been able to pay, and business cards from clients who never called back. At the garage later that afternoon, things were slow. Again. Mason swept the same spot 3 times, checked the same tool drawer twice, just for something to do. Lila was in the corner with Charlie, coloring on scrap paper he'd cut from unused invoices. The bell above the shop door jingled mid-afternoon. Mason didn't look up at first, not until he heard the voice. "Excuse me, I think my car needs saving." Claire stood in the doorway, one hand on her hip, the other holding out a cup of coffee toward him like a peace offering. She wore jeans this time, a simple navy sweater, her hair pulled back messily like she didn't care who noticed. And she looked comfortable. He smirked. "Coffee for diagnostics? Dangerous precedent. Consider it a bribe." He took the cup, their fingers brushing, just for a second. But it was enough to notice the way his breath caught, and hers did too. "Be honest," he said, sipping. "Anything actually wrong with the car this time?" Claire shrugged. Maybe I just wanted to come back." Mason set the cup down slowly. "Then don't pretend it's the engine." "I won't," she said, softer now. "But I'm still learning how not to." They stood there, just watching each other. No labels, no roles. Just 2 people who had both learned the hard way what silence really meant, and what it felt like when someone finally showed up and stayed. Claire walked slowly through the garage, her heels traded in for boots that crunched faintly on the concrete floor. She moved differently today, less like a guest, more like someone looking for a reason to stay. Her fingers skimmed along the edge of the tool bench, tracing the outline of a socket wrench like it was some kind of artifact. Mason watched her from across the room, pretending to organize parts that didn't need organizing. He didn't ask why she was really there. He already knew. "So, she said, turning toward him. "You always keep the place this spotless, or did I catch you on a good week?" He smirked. "You're giving me way too much credit. That's just panic cleaning." She laughed, genuinely, and something in his chest softened. Lila peeked her head out from the office, and upon seeing Claire, lit up like a sunrise. "Miss Toy Lady," she squealed, running over and wrapping herself around Claire's legs. Claire knelt down and hugged her tightly, her face burying in Lila's curls. "Hey, you," she whispered. "Charlie still being a gentleman?" Lila nodded eagerly. "He sleeps with one eye open now, says he's guarding my dreams." Claire's smile faltered for just a second, blinking back the sudden sting in her eyes. She pulled Lila into her lap and sat on the garage floor like it was the most natural thing in the world. Mason leaned back against the workbench, arms folded, studying them. Claire, this woman who walked out of a luxury car and into his daughter's world without hesitation, looked completely at home, in the middle of grease and cracked tiles, and dreams held together with duct tape. "Why a toy store?" he asked, finally breaking the moment. Claire looked up at him, brushing Lila's hair from her face. "Because I got tired of building things I didn't believe in. Numbers, reports, empty handshakes. I wanted to build something that made people feel something again." "And did you?" Her eyes flicked to Lila, then to him. "I think I just started to." There was no flirtation in her voice, no performance, just truth. And Mason realized something dangerous in that moment. He wasn't just grateful anymore. He was starting to need her. The next morning, the sky was the kind of bright that hurt to look at. Clean and cloudless, like the world had been scrubbed overnight. Mason sat on the edge of the garage roof, legs dangling over the ledge, coffee in one hand, silence in the other. Below, the street buzzed to life slowly. Nothing fast ever happened in this part of town, except maybe the way he'd started thinking about Claire. He hated how natural it felt. She'd only been in their lives for a few days, but something about her had already threaded itself through the edges of his routine. Her laughter still echoed off the garage walls long after she'd left. Her scent still lingered faintly in the air, like perfume clinging to memory. He hadn't told anyone. Who would he tell? Lila didn't understand grown-up things like caution, or fear of losing what little you have left, but he did. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and closed his eyes. The feeling wasn't just attraction, it was danger. The kind of danger that sneaks in through kindness, the kind that makes you believe maybe this time will be different. Maybe she's not like the others who promised to stay. The crunch of gravel broke his thoughts. He leaned forward slightly and spotted Claire stepping out of her car. Again. She carried 2 coffee cups this time and wore a black turtleneck and jeans, like she was trying hard not to look like someone used to marble floors and valet parking. She didn't look up until she was at the door, only to find it locked. Mason climbed down and met her at the entrance, keys in hand. "Twice in 1 week," he said, half a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "People are going to start talking." "Let them," she said, handing him one of the coffees. "I can take it." He unlocked the door, their fingers brushing again. Too familiar, too soon. But he didn't move away, and neither did she. "I was wondering," she said carefully, eyes searching his face, "would you and Lila come to something with me?" He hesitated. What kind of something? Claire took a breath. A reopening event, for the toy store, just a small gathering. Mason studied her. "You own it, don't you?" She held his gaze, and this time she didn't lie. "I do." Mason stood in the middle of the garage long after Claire left, her words echoing in his head like a loose bolt rattling inside an engine. "I do." She owned it? The toy shop? The whole place? Of course she did. He should have known. The way she carried herself, the way she changed the price of that bear without blinking, the way she didn't flinch when she walked into a place like this. A place that reeked of oil and old struggle. She wasn't playing a part. She was just living in 2 different worlds, one where she was a woman with means and one where she looked at him like he wasn't invisible, and he didn't know which one scared him more. He'd spent years convincing himself that people like Claire didn't exist, at least not for men like him. Not for the ones who smelled like grease and came home with clothes they couldn't afford to replace. Not for the ones who had nothing left to offer but loyalty and time and the kind of love that didn't come with diamonds or getaways. And yet she asked him to come. Lila squealed when he told her, jumped up and down in her socks, clutching Charlie to her chest, already deciding which dress she'd wear. "Can I bring her a thank-you drawing?" she asked. "One with glitter?" Mason nodded, forcing a smile. "She'd love that." But when Lila left the room to find her crayons, he sat down on the couch and stared at the floor. What if he showed up and didn't belong? What if this was all some kind of soft charity, a woman trying to play savior to a man with a broken wallet, and a daughter with bright eyes and no clue what the world could take from her? He rubbed his hands together, staring at the calluses. Claire hadn't looked at him with pity, not once. But still, he couldn't shake the voice in his head, whispering that the moment he stepped into her world, he'd feel it. That slow, quiet humiliation of knowing you're out of place. And staying anyway, because a part of him, no matter how hard he tried to fight it, wanted to believe she wasn't just inviting him into a building. She was inviting him into something he'd stopped believing he deserved. The night before the event, Mason lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling like it might offer an answer he hadn't thought of yet. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Lila was asleep in her room, her drawing for Claire tucked safely under her pillow, the glitter barely dry. She'd asked him 3 times if her dress was fancy enough, and each time he'd said yes, even though he wasn't sure he'd ever worn anything that counted as fancy. He turned onto his side, pulled the thin blanket up to his shoulders, and shut his eyes. But sleep didn't come. His mind wouldn't let it. It kept circling back to Claire, to her laugh, to the way she looked at Lila like she was already part of something, and to the way she looked at him, like he wasn't just some tired man hanging on by the threads of his pride. The truth was, he hadn't been in a room full of polished people in years, not since his wife's funeral, and even then, it was different. That was grief. This was something else. This was him walking into a space he didn't build beside a woman who didn't have to invite him, but did anyway. He didn't know what that meant, or what she wanted from him. Maybe nothing. Maybe something he wasn't ready for. But when morning came and he saw Lila standing in her dress, hair brushed, shoes cleaned, her little fingers clinging to Charlie like he was a talisman, he knew he couldn't back out. Not now. The toy store looked different when they arrived. The windows were cleaned, the lights inside glowed softer, and music played faintly through speakers mounted above the door. There were balloons tied to the railing, and people, well-dressed people, mingled near the entrance, sipping drinks from glass cups, not paper ones. Mason stepped out of the car and adjusted his collar, suddenly aware of every wrinkle in his shirt, every scuff on his shoes. Lila didn't notice. She just grabbed his hand, her eyes wide with wonder. "Are you nervous, Daddy?" He looked down at her, smiled tightly. "Maybe a little." "Don't be," she whispered, squeezing his fingers. "We're supposed to be here." And he didn't know how she knew that, but in that moment he wanted to believe it. The moment Mason stepped inside the store, the air changed. It wasn't just warmer, it was different, cleaner, sharper. The walls had been repainted in soft creams and golds, the shelves rearranged with deliberate care, each toy positioned like a centerpiece. It wasn't a toy store anymore. It was a gallery of innocence, curated and glowing. People milled about in tailored coats and quiet shoes, their conversations a low hum of polished voices and practiced laughter. Mason felt the weight of it immediately, the way their eyes flicked toward him, then slid away. Not cruel, just curious, like he was a detail they couldn't quite place, like they were waiting for someone to explain what he was doing here. He kept his chin level, his back straight, holding Lila's hand tightly as they moved past the shelves. She didn't notice the looks. Her eyes danced from one display to the next, cheeks flushed, completely unaware that her father was trying not to drown in the feeling of being misplaced. Then Claire appeared. She stepped out from behind a group of guests, like the room had been waiting for her. Her dress was simple but stunning, deep green, cinched at the waist, with sleeves that fell just past her elbows. Her hair was down, curled in soft waves, and her eyes, they went straight to him. She didn't hesitate. She walked toward them, past the donors and executives, past the employees with name tags and clipboards, and smiled. "You made it." Mason nodded once. "Told Lila we would." Claire crouched beside the little girl. "And you brought Charlie?" Lila beamed, holding up the bear and the drawing in her other hand. "I made you something." Claire took it with both hands like it was fragile. She didn't glance at it politely. She studied it, every glitter-covered line, every scribbled heart. "I love it," she said, her voice warm and full. Mason watched her, still guarded, still unsure. Claire stood and faced him again. "I want to introduce you to someone." He stiffened. "Claire, I don't—" But she cut him off with a quiet smile. "He's not a stranger. He's the man who taught me what kindness looks like." And just like that, the room didn't feel so loud anymore. Mason followed Claire through the softly lit store, Lila skipping ahead with Charlie dangling from her arms. The crowd parted as they moved, subtle but noticeable. People turned, glanced, whispered. Mason could feel it under his skin like static. He didn't belong here, and the room seemed to know it. His shirt was pressed, but the collar had gone soft from too many washes. His boots were clean but worn. He wasn't dressed for this kind of place, or this kind of woman. Claire didn't flinch. She walked beside him like he belonged to the space more than anyone else in it. She introduced him to a man in a dark suit. her company's head of operations, to a woman in pearls, head of community partnerships. Each time she said his name clearly. Each time she made no excuses, no explanations. "This is Mason," she'd say. "He's someone I deeply respect." And that word, respect. It rang louder in his ears than the music overhead. They stopped near a table draped in white linen and glass platters. Claire turned to pour a drink, and Mason took a moment to breathe. That's when a voice, smooth and quiet, cut through from behind him. "So this is the man." Mason turned slowly. A man stood just behind him. Silver hair, perfectly cut blazer, the kind of confidence that came from owning more than just rooms. His eyes weren't cold, but they weren't warm either. They assessed. Claire returned before Mason could respond, her smile polite but different, more practiced. "Mason, this is Robert Lang, board chair." Robert extended a hand. "Pleasure." Mason shook it, firm, steady. "Likewise." There was a pause, not awkward, intentional. Robert's gaze shifted to Claire. "You've been quiet about him." Claire didn't blink. "That's because it's personal." That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. Robert gave a tight nod and walked away without another word. Mason exhaled, jaw tight. "You sure you want me here?" Claire turned to him, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm sure. And if anyone here has a problem with that, they're not the ones I answer to." For the first time all night, he let himself believe her. The evening wore on, and the toy store hummed with soft conversation and clinking glasses. Lila sat cross-legged near a reading nook in the back, showing Charlie to a pair of kids she'd just met, her laughter rising above the grown-up voices like music. Mason watched her from a distance, one hand resting in his pocket, the other wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched. Claire stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her shoulder, but neither of them spoke for a while. The room around them was everything he wasn't, delicate, polished, full of people with money in their pockets and nothing in their eyes he could recognize. "You were right," he finally said, eyes fixed on his daughter, "about her needing to be here, about us coming." Claire looked over at him, eyebrows lifting just slightly. "But?" He hesitated, rolling the condensation from the glass against his fingers. "I don't think I've ever felt more visible in my life, or more wrong." "Wrong?" she repeated, a sharpness slipping into her voice. He nodded. "Like I walked into a story that wasn't written for me." Claire turned to face him fully, arms folding loosely across her chest. "You think I invited you here to put you on display?" "No," he said quietly. "I think you invited me because you don't see it that way. But look around, Claire. Everyone else does." She didn't deny it. She didn't soften it either. "I know," she admitted. "But that's not on you. That's on them." He met her eyes. And for the first time he didn't see the calm, confident woman from the shop. He saw someone fighting just as hard as he was, only her battles had walls made of glass instead of rusted steel. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked, not accusing, just tired. "Why me? Why Lila?" Claire's expression shifted, a flicker of vulnerability surfacing through her poise. "Because the last time someone helped me, with no agenda, no price tag, I was 6, and I never forgot it. You reminded me what that felt like." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. But something cracked open between them, and neither one tried to close it. It was well past sunset by the time they left the store. The night had stretched into something softer, less about champagne and donors, and more about quiet truths passed between glances. Lila was asleep in the back seat, her cheek pressed against Charlie, one shoe dangling halfway off. The car ride had lulled her into a peace Mason hadn't seen in a long time. And for once, he didn't want to disturb it. He parked outside the apartment and turned off the engine, the sudden silence wrapping around them like a blanket too heavy to shake off. Claire sat beside him in the passenger seat, her coat draped across her lap, the event badge she'd worn now resting on the floor. Neither of them moved to get out. "She was proud," Claire said, breaking the quiet. "You should have seen her when she showed that drawing to the store manager. Said it was payment for all the kindness." Mason smiled faintly. "That sounds like her." Claire looked down at her hands, her voice dropping. "You know, I grew up around people who thought kindness was weakness, that helping someone meant they owed you, or that you only give when it gets you something better in return." "Sounds familiar," Mason muttered. She turned her head toward him. "But then I met this man in a garage who had nothing, who gave the last dollar in his pocket to make sure his daughter didn't feel forgotten, and didn't even want to be thanked for it. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Not yet." Claire leaned back against the seat, exhaling through her nose. "I don't know what this is yet, what's happening between us, but I do know I don't want it to be a secret." Mason's jaw tightened. "Claire, I'm not embarrassed by you. I'm just realistic. You live in a world where people don't see me. They look through me." "Then let them," she said, sharper now. "But I don't." She reached across the console, her hand brushing his, just enough to ask, not enough to push, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. The next morning, the sky was iron gray, heavy, still, the kind of sky that promised something was coming, but didn't say what. Mason stood in the kitchen, watching the coffee drip into the pot, the faint gurgle the only sound in the apartment. Lila was still asleep, curled under a blanket, her bear tucked against her chest like he was guarding her from the weight of the world. Mason didn't know how to name the feeling inside him. It wasn't fear, not quite. It was deeper than that, more personal. A dull ache in the part of him that still believed good things weren't meant to stay, that the moment you let your guard down, life would find a way to remind you who you really were. He poured the coffee, took a sip, and winced. Burnt again. His phone buzzed on the counter. A message, unknown number. "You might want to turn on the news, Channel 7. He frowned, grabbed the remote, and clicked on the old TV balanced precariously on top of the bookshelf. The image flickered before clearing into a morning news panel. A photo filled the screen. Claire, standing in front of the toy store, dressed in green, smiling beside a young girl holding a teddy bear. Lila. The caption below said it all. Heiress Claire Ashford's mysterious +1 raises eyebrows at store reopening event. His name wasn't mentioned, but his face was there just behind Claire's. The camera had caught him mid-smile, unaware, vulnerable, too real, too exposed. He turned the volume up. The anchor was already speculating. Sources say Ashford's appearance with the unknown man was unexpected, sparking questions about the nature of their relationship. While Ashford has historically kept her private life guarded, this marks the first public appearance with He turned it off. The silence afterward felt louder than the broadcast. He sank into the chair beside the kitchen table and stared at the floor. She hadn't warned him, not about the cameras, not about the fallout, not about the people who would turn something beautiful into something dissected. For a moment the trust between them cracked. And in the quiet that followed, Mason wondered if he was about to lose something he never had the right to hope for in the first place. By the time Claire knocked on his door, the day had already turned sour. The sky had opened up with a cold, relentless rain, the kind that soaks you in seconds and makes the whole world feel like it's unraveling. Mason didn't answer right away. He stood in the living room, staring at the door like it had betrayed him just by letting her knock. She knocked again, softer this time. Then her voice muffled through the wood. "Mason, please." He opened it. Claire stood there, hair damp, makeup barely holding, her coat clinging to her like it didn't belong. She looked smaller in the storm, not fragile, just human. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "The news, the headlines, the guesses, the commentary." "I know. You didn't think to give me a heads up?" "I didn't know they'd run it that fast," she said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to be a story. It was a night. That's all." "Yeah, well, he muttered, stepping aside so she could come in. "When you're a billionaire who strolls into a party with a mechanic, apparently that's headline material." Claire walked in slowly, her eyes flicking to the floor like she didn't know where to begin. "I'm sorry. That's not what this is about," Mason said, voice low but steady. "It's not about cameras or people whispering. It's about being dragged into a world that doesn't know what it means to leave someone like me behind." "I'm not leaving you behind." "No?" He gestured toward the TV, still on mute, with his face frozen on the screen. "Because it sure feels like I'm being used as some story arc. The mysterious blue-collar guy with the soft eyes and the hard life." "You think I haven't seen this movie before?" Claire stepped closer. "You think I planned this? That I brought you to the store to show you off? I brought you because I wanted you there. I didn't care who saw." "That's the difference," he said, locking eyes with her now. "You don't care who sees. But I've got a little girl to protect, and I'm not going to let her get turned into some headline punchline." Claire swallowed hard. "I would never let that happen." Mason didn't respond. He just turned away, the silence between them thick with everything he was afraid to say, and everything she couldn't take back. Claire stood frozen in the middle of his living room, her hands trembling at her sides. The rain thudded harder against the windows, like even the storm outside was losing patience. Mason paced once, then stopped, his back to her, jaw tight. The air between them felt sharp, brittle, like one wrong word could shatter it all. "I didn't mean for this to spiral," she said finally. "I didn't think they'd turn it into a narrative." "You didn't think," Mason echoed, not accusing, just tired. "That's the problem, Claire. You didn't have to." She stepped forward slowly. "Then help me understand. Tell me what I should have done." "You should have told me who you really were the first time you walked into my shop," he said, voice quiet but full of weight. "You should have told me before you let my daughter draw you pictures and fall asleep with that bear in her arms, thinking we finally found someone who wasn't going to disappear." "I wasn't hiding," she said, pain threading through her voice. "I was trying to be someone real, for once." Mason turned. "You were real. But this?" He gestured around the room, toward the TV still glowing with frozen headlines. "This is your world bleeding into mine, and I don't get the luxury of pretending it's not messy." Claire looked at him, her eyes brimming now, not just with guilt, but fear. "So what? That's it? You shut the door because some cameras found us before we figured out what this even is?" He didn't answer right away. His hands fell to his sides, clenched. "I shut the door," he said carefully, "because I've lived in a world where people leave when it gets inconvenient, where Lila wakes up asking where people went, and I can't, let her feel that again." Claire's voice cracked. "I never planned to leave." "No," he said, the words dry in his throat. "But the thing about people like you is, you don't have to. The world does it for you." She blinked slowly, as if his words had knocked the wind from her chest. Then, without another word, she turned and walked to the door. Mason didn't stop her. And when the door clicked shut, it sounded exactly like the past catching up. The next morning came hollow and gray, not a single beam of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Mason sat alone in the garage, the front bay door half open, letting in the cold air and the sound of tires hissing past on wet asphalt. He hadn't opened the shop properly. He hadn't even flipped the sign. It didn't matter. No one was coming. He stared at the cracked concrete beneath his boots, jaw clenched, knuckles white around a wrench he didn't need. The night before replayed on a loop, Claire standing at his door soaked in rain, her eyes wide and hurt, her voice breaking, and then gone. Just like that. One decision, one line crossed, one silence that should have been filled. He told himself he was doing the right thing, protecting Lila, shielding her from being caught in someone else's orbit, only to be flung out again the moment the story changed. He knew what that looked like. He knew what it felt like to be someone's passing lesson. But it didn't feel like safety this time. It felt like loss. He heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him and turned to find Lila, wrapped in her too big hoodie, bare dangling from one hand, sleep still clinging to her eyes. She walked over, sat down beside him, without saying a word. For a long time they just sat there. Then she asked, "Is Miss Claire mad at us?" Mason swallowed, the words lodged deep. "No, baby, she's not mad. Things just got a little messy." Lila nodded like she understood more than she should. Sometimes when stuff gets messy, it means it's important. He looked at her, surprised. "That what Mommy used to say," she added quietly. "When we dropped the paint on the floor, she didn't yell. She just smiled and said, 'Messy means we tried.'" Mason stared at the floor again, the wrench slipping from his hand. Lila leaned her head on his arm, her voice soft. "I liked when Miss Claire was around. You smiled more." He closed his eyes, jaw tightening. "Me too," he whispered. And that's when he knew. He hadn't shut the door to protect Lila. He'd shut it because he was scared. And now the silence was too loud to ignore. Claire stood in front of the mirror in her office, staring at a reflection that didn't feel like her anymore. The makeup was flawless, the blazer sharp, the heels pristine, but it all felt like a costume now, a mask layered over someone who had, just days ago, knelt on a concrete floor with a little girl and a bear and believed she'd finally found something real. The news cycle had moved on. The story had faded, replaced by stock numbers and new headlines about acquisitions and tech deals. But the photo, that photo, still lived in the corners of the internet, archived and dissected. People had labeled Mason everything from blue-collar hero to charity case. And she hated them all. None of those words belonged to him. They never did. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her, but she didn't turn around. She knew what it was. Another board member. Another investor. Another person asking if she'd cleared things up. She hadn't answered any of them, because the only voice she wanted to hear hadn't called. A knock came at the door. "Come in," she said, barely above a whisper. Her assistant stepped in, holding an envelope. This came by courier, hand-delivered, no return address. Claire took it with slow hands. The paper was soft, weathered slightly at the edges, familiar. She opened it and unfolded the single sheet inside. It was a child's drawing. Crayon hearts, a bear. A smiling stick figure with a crown labeled Miss Claire. In the corner, written carefully, in pink letters, "Messy means we tried." Claire's breath caught. No note, no name, but she knew who sent it. She pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closing. Something cracked open inside her. A dam held too long, too tightly. The tears came, silent and warm, not from regret, but recognition, the kind that says, "You haven't lost everything yet." She opened her eyes, wiping her cheeks. Then she stood. No more hiding behind schedules, no more letting other people define the story. If Mason was too afraid to step forward, she'd meet him halfway. She was done watching from behind glass. It was time to show up, for real. The garage was almost empty when Claire pulled up. No music played, no chatter, just the metallic echo of a wrench clattering to the floor as Mason looked up and saw her standing there. She stepped out of her car slowly, her heels crunching against gravel and wet leaves. No makeup this time, no curated outfit, just jeans, boots, and a black sweater that hung loose around her shoulders like it didn't know how to carry the weight she'd been holding. Mason straightened but didn't move toward her. He stayed half in shadow, grease smudged on his forearm, jaw set like he was bracing for impact. Claire stopped a few feet away. Close enough to speak, far enough to leave room if he needed it. "I got your letter," she said. He blinked. "I didn't send a letter." She pulled out the drawing from her coat pocket, unfolded it with care, held it up like proof. Seemed like a message. His lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Lila's idea." Claire nodded. "Smart girl." "She gets that from her mom." Another silence stretched between them. Not hostile, not cold, just fragile. Claire took a slow breath. "I didn't come here to apologize again. I've done enough of that. I came because you were right. About all of it. About how easily I get to walk away when things get complicated." He looked down, fingers tightening around a rag. "You didn't have to come." "I know," she said. "But I wanted to, and I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. I meant every moment, every word. It wasn't a show. It wasn't charity. I didn't invite you into my world because I wanted to fix yours. I did it because when I was with you, I finally liked mine." That caught him. His eyes flicked up, full of something raw and searching. Claire took one step closer. "If you don't want to open the door again, I'll leave, but I won't pretend it didn't mean something." Mason stared at her, long enough for her breath to hitch. Then, finally, he stepped forward. And this time, he didn't stop halfway. They didn't kiss. Not yet. That would have been too easy, too scripted, like a scene borrowed from a movie that didn't belong to them. Instead, Mason just stood there in front of her, close enough to feel her breath, close enough to see the water still clinging to the strands of her hair. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything. They didn't have to. "I was scared," he admitted finally. The words came low and rough, like they'd been sitting inside him for too long. "Not just of the cameras, not just of your world. I was scared because when something starts to feel real again, it means it can be taken." Claire didn't flinch. "You think I'm going anywhere?" He looked at her, and for once didn't look away. "I think I've lost enough to know it happens when you least expect it." She nodded slowly, stepping forward, bridging the last few inches of space between them. "Then let's not expect it. Let's stop living like it's already gone." He let out a breath, one that sounded more like surrender than relief. And she reached up, carefully, gently, and brushed her fingers against his cheek. It was such a small thing, but it felt like everything, like a promise she didn't need to say out loud. Behind them, the garage lights flickered to life as Lila came bounding through the back door, her shoes soaked from puddles, and Charlie clutched tight in her arms. She froze when she saw Claire, her eyes wide, unsure. Claire turned toward her, crouching down slowly. "Hey!" Lila looked at her dad, then back at Claire. "Are you staying this time?" Claire smiled, soft and sure. "Only if you want me to." Lila didn't answer. She just ran forward and threw her arms around Claire's neck, the bear squished between them. Mason watched it unfold, and the last wall inside him finally cracked. Not from pressure, from peace. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't some fairy tale. This was real, messy, unfinished, terrifying. And finally his again. A week later, the garage felt different. It wasn't the tools. They were still scattered in the same stubborn chaos Mason understood like a second language. It wasn't the leaks in the roof or the way the heater groaned before giving up. Those things hadn't changed. What had shifted was the air, the stillness, the silence that used to stretch too long between moments. Now, laughter interrupted it. Lila's voice echoing off the walls. Claire's soft hum as she organized bolts without being asked, the smell of burnt grilled cheese sneaking into the office from the hot plate. Mason stood in the center of it all, watching as Claire crouched next to Lila by the tire rack. They were sorting washers into jars, like it was some kind of game. Lila was serious about it, tongue sticking out as she worked, while Claire whispered commentary like a sports announcer narrating a championship match. He should have been used to it by now, the way Claire blended in like she belonged. But he wasn't. It caught him off guard every time. How someone who came from a world of marble floors and silent elevators could find peace in a place where the floor was cracked and the coffee machine never worked. Claire looked up suddenly, catching him watching. "What?" she asked, smiling. He shrugged. "Just trying to figure out how you make it look easy." She tilted her head. "What? Sorting hardware?" "No," he said, his voice softer now. "Staying." Claire stood and walked toward him, slow, deliberate. She stopped just close enough for her voice to drop. "It's not easy. It's terrifying. But I'm more afraid of leaving than staying. So I stay." He didn't say anything. He just nodded, the words threading through something deep in him that had been starved for too long. "I want to show you something," she said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. He took it, unfolded it, and frowned. It was a set of blueprints, a small building, an extension. "Is this—" "A second garage," she said. "Funded by me, run by you." He looked up, stunned. Claire held his gaze. "This time, you don't fix things alone." The sun was just starting to set when the final bolt clicked into place. Mason stepped back, hands on his hips, staring at the new sign, freshly mounted on the front of the building. The letters were bold, but simple, painted by hand. Turner and Ashford Auto Works. Below it, in smaller script, read, "Built on Trust." He wiped the sweat from his brow with a grease-stained rag and glanced toward the entrance, where Claire stood with her arms crossed, her silhouette framed by the glow of the new overhead lights. She looked proud, but not in the way most people wear pride. This wasn't for the cameras. There were no reporters here, no press releases, no photo ops, just them, and a space they built together. Lila came flying out of the office, Charlie tucked under one arm, a trail of glitter stickers and peanut butter smudges marking her path. "Daddy, Miss Claire said we can paint my name on the wall inside." Mason laughed. "Only if you spell it right this time." "I will," she said confidently. "Claire's going to help me." Claire smiled, her eyes locking with Mason's. "I promised her. No backing out now." He walked toward her slowly, wiping his hands on the rag. "You really mean to stay in this?" Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she took his hand, the same one covered in dried oil and half a lifetime of work, and laced her fingers through it. "I've spent years building things that looked perfect on the outside, but felt empty inside," she said. "This—" She looked around the garage, the office, Lila chasing a dog-eared teddy bear across the floor. "This isn't perfect. It's cracked and messy and louder than I'm used to."
"But it's real."
Mason swallowed hard. His voice caught somewhere between breath and disbelief. "So what now?" Claire stepped in closer, rested her forehead lightly against his. "Now we don't look back." And for the first time in his life, Mason believed that a future could be made from the pieces he thought were broken. Not in spite of them, because of them.